For more than 3 years, David MacNaughton has arguably been Canada's most important diplomat on the world stage, spending months helping renegotiate a monumental trade pact with Canada's largest trading partner. But today, MacNaughton announced he is stepping down as ambassador to the U.S. effective at the end of the summer.
I leave here with some pride in what we have accomplished. Clearly, there are still challenges in front of us. I feel confident that we have done a great job and that the relationship is in good shape and in good hands.
Most Canadians know MacNaughton for his role in NAFTA talks, but his Liberal ties run deep. In the 70s, he was a senior advisor to Liberal Cabinet Minister Don Jamieson and ran Don Johnston's unsuccessful campaign to be Liberal leader in 1984.
You've got to give Canadians a reason that the Liberal Party wants to win the next election.
Then he moved to provincial politics. MacNaughton chaired David Peterson's election campaign, making him Premier of Ontario. In 2003, he served in the government of Dalton McGuinty. And it is during those years in Ontario that he developed a close working relationship and friendship with Jerry Butts, who would go on to be Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's principal secretary, and Katie Telford, who still serves as Trudeau's chief of staff. All three remained close friends and relied on that friendship in the 2015 federal election campaign. MacNaughton served as the Ontario co-chair for the federal Liberals, and we all know how that ended. The following year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sent MacNaughton to Washington to be Canada's top representative. NAFTA talks did conclude with an agreement last November between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. But significant hurdles remain, particularly in the U.S. Canadian officials, including MacNaughton, are trying to convince the reluctant Democrats that it's a good deal and they should ratify it. So what will MacNaughton's departure mean for the new trade deal and for Canada-U.S. relations? Laura Dawson is the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre. She joins us from Washington. And Sarah Goldfeder is a former U.S. diplomat and is currently a principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and she is here with me in studio. Laura, I'm going to start with you because you are in Washington. What kind of impact is David MacNaughton's departure going to have?
Oh, it's really bittersweet, Katie. I mean, he has just been a rock star. And it's funny because when he first came, the Canada-US watchers are like, who the heck is this guy? Has anybody ever heard of him? Does he have any presence in the Canada-US space? No, no, and no. Turns out he's been the architect, really the quarterback for the whole Team Canada approach that the Trudeau government took. I mean, he's really led Canada through extremely challenging times here in Washington with just the most amazing skill. He's a guy who's playing three-level chess most of the time, and so his departure is really a loss. At the same time, it may be a good time for Kirsten Hillman to move in as the new ambassador. She certainly got a ton of skill and a ton of experience. So you know, he's a campaigner. His campaign is maybe done here, and he's going back to Canada to return to his regularly scheduled life.
Sarah, I want to ask you, from the American perspective, David MacNaughton was ambassador at a very difficult time in the Canada-U.S. relationship. Was he effective in getting Canada's message through to the Americans?
I think so. I think that he was exactly the right person, especially to deal with Bob Lighthizer. And he was a good, measured voice that spoke a language of business that all of these guys understood. And so clearly the proof is in the pudding. I mean, they were able to get this deal done. He wrote a very long statement that's on the Connect to Canada website, the Canadian Embassy's website, where he outlines a lot of the challenges that he faced and the things that he has to speak for at the end of the day. He's got a lot of major accomplishments at a very difficult time in an environment that is really unlike anything we've ever seen in the relationship before.
And from that American perspective, if Chrysler Freeland came in and played a bit of bad cop, perhaps David MacNaughton came in and was this old school guy that
spoke their language
that Robert Lighthizer sort of got along with, and even in those most difficult times, were they able to sort of connect from your understanding?
Lighthizer and MacNaughton, absolutely, and I think you saw that today. There was a tweet by Lighthizer praising MacNaughton and saying he'll really miss him, and so that was a nice touch.
Laura, I want to ask you, MacNaughton is leaving before NAFTA is across the finish line. It's a very difficult time in U.S. Congress. It's very divided. The Democrats don't necessarily want to give Donald Trump any wins here. Is it a smart move that MacNaughton left before this is ratified?
I'm not sure what else Ambassador McNaughton could have done at this point. I mean, he was really, in addition to managing relations with Washington, he was managing the home game back in Ottawa. I mean, this Team Canada approach that we're all so pleased with, it could have gone wrong in so many different ways. Marshalling the premiers and the business leaders and the mayors and the conservatives and liberals and everybody marching in lockstep down the streets in Washington in order to influence people here. That's when you really needed somebody like MacNaughton, when there was an opportunity to move things in Canada's favor or to ensure that the NAFTA stays in place. At this point, it really is up to the U.S. Congress. It really is up to the Democrats, the Republicans, and the deal that Robert Lighthizer can make. There's nothing really that Canada can do more than has already been done. And again, Kirsten Hillman is a great trade leader. She led Canada's Trans-Pacific Partnership trade delegation team. She is extremely experienced. So on that detailed, close work, there's nobody better than her to take this negotiation the next step to the extent that Canada can be involved at all.
Laura, I was going to ask you, from your knowledge and what you know about Kirsten Hillman, what should Canadians know about her? She's not necessarily, she's a diplomat, and diplomats in Canada don't necessarily get the same kind of attention that they do in the United States, but she's stepping in, even if just temporarily, into a very high-profile role. What should Canadians know about her?
Well, the first thing you should know is she is definitely not the B team. She is somebody who is absolutely ready for a senior position as a head of mission. Coming from, again, leading Canada in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, she is firing on all cylinders. I think we were kind of surprised that somebody with her experience and skill actually came in to what could have been perceived to be a secondary position. But now that she will be acting ambassador, there's going to be no learning curve. There's going to be no difficult transition. She's been absolutely in lockstep with Ambassador McNaughton. She knows the relationship, she knows the players, she knows the team in Washington, and she knows the technical stuff super well. Also, it's really good to see a woman in that position. Again, she's acting as ambassador. We've never had a Canadian woman ambassador to the United States. The U.S. has got us beat on that with Ambassador Kelly Knight-Craft. So I'm delighted to see her in that position.
Sarah, if trade is the most important thing between the Canada-U.S. relationship, and you know it's a very difficult situation in Washington right now with Congress. What are her challenges, Kirsten Hillman's challenges, going to be as she tries to help nudge the NAFTA ratification process along?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge is that both Canada and the United States have generally sent politically appointed ambassadors to each other's capitals, and for a good reason, for the reason that there's connectivity there, there's the voice and the ear of the capital, of the leader's office, the Prime Minister and the President. And so right now we have parity. We have in both capitals, you have a chargé d'affaires. You have Richard Mills up here in Ottawa as the chargé d'affaires for the Americans, and you'll have her as a chargé d'affaires in Washington for the Canadians. And so it may change the level of political dynamism that they're able to attract because they're both career bureaucrats or career diplomats. And while that speaks to a lot of experience and they'll understand, they may not get the political buy-in because they don't have that connectivity that the other two had.
Laura, I want to ask you, the Canada-U.S. relationship is something that obviously gets a ton of attention up here north of the border, but it is not something that gets any attention down there. Will the White House be paying attention to this? Does this matter to the Trump administration?
I think the White House is paying some attention. Certainly there are always officials at the White House who are paying attention to what's going on in Canada. And there are always important issues that have to be managed. Whether that is ensuring that Canada and the U.S. are working together on important foreign policy issues like Venezuela, certainly on the military and security relationship. And now we've got this weirdness with Canadian pharmaceuticals potentially being supplied to the United States. So it is definitely no time to take your hand off the switch. So Americans are paying attention to Canada, but for the most part, I hate to say it, most Americans look at the Canadian relationship as sort of condominium association or a self-cleaning oven. It looks after itself.
And Sarah, my last question to you, same question. Is the Trump administration paying attention? Is the Canada relationship anything that even matters at this point, given the big challenges that Americans are facing on a number of different fronts?
I think that's a fair point. There's a lot of oxygen being taken up with domestic issues right now, domestic issues that are really divisive and very anxiety producing for Americans. And as we head into the election in 2020, those are the issues that Americans want to talk about. And Canada's issues, while they come to the fore when we have a dairy issue in Wisconsin, or we have some other trade issue in South Carolina having to do with softwood or something, those are the issues that speak to very specific regions. But overall in the United States right now, there are a lot bigger fish to fry.
All right, I want to thank both Sarah Goldfeder here in Ottawa and Laura Dawson in Washington.
Thank you, Katie.
I've never done anything in my life that has been as difficult as this. Physically, emotionally, and part of that is just realizing what the stakes are. And you're not just dealing with numbers or a balance sheet or whether it's a profit and loss statement, you're talking about people and communities. And so you feel an extraordinary burden to do the best you can.
Canada's ambassador to the U.S., David MacNaughton, is leaving his post at the end of the month. A longtime Liberal insider, MacNaughton was appointed in 2016 at the tail end of the Obama administration. He went on to play a key role in negotiating a new NAFTA with the Trump administration. So what does this mean for the Canada-U.S. relationship going forward? It is time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Marcella Monroe is a senior strategist at KTG Public Affairs. She's in Calgary. In Toronto, Melissa Lantzman is the vice president of public affairs at Hill & Knowlton Strategies. And in Montreal, David Hertel is a former Quebec Liberal immigration and environment minister. Let's start with you, David. Overall, what impact is David MacNaughton's departure going to have on the Canada-U.S. relationship, do you think, if any?
Well, I don't see an immediate impact, but there is one significant fact here. Canada has no ambassadors in the two largest economic powers in the world right now, the U.S. and China. And considering the fact that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada deal has yet to be ratified by the United States, Congress hasn't moved on it yet. There's still a lot of work to be done. Plus, we're in the election cycle here in Canada, of course. So this calls into question, I think, the role of an ambassador. From a public policy perspective, we need to think clearly about what types of skill sets we need for our ambassadors. Right now, I think it's very important to see with the global issues that we have. You talk about cybersecurity, you talk about climate change, talk about immigration, talk about trade, of course. I think looking forward, I'm pretty concerned about the fact that it seems that the Trudeau government will not name a new ambassador until at least the election, if not beyond. So what does this say about the importance of the ambassador's role and how important it should actually be?
Melissa, should Canadians be concerned that there's no ambassador? Well, David MacNaughton will stay till the end of the summer, but should Canadians be concerned that there's going to be no ambassador in the U.S.? Kirsten Hillman will be stepping into that role temporarily, and we've heard from a number of experts who say she's very qualified, but again, she's acting ambassador. Canada still has no ambassador in China right now. Should Canadians be worried?
I absolutely think so, that we don't have ambassadors, and we do have somebody that steps in to fill the role in the U.S. We don't have ambassadors in two very major relationships, one that have been rocky over the last year or longer than that. First, I think before we sort of talk about the politics of this, I think it's incumbent on all of us as Canadians to thank Mr. MacNaughton for his service, his years of dedication in the realms of public service, and frankly that he has been the saving grace to this government in the U.S. negotiating a really, really tough agreement, one that isn't done yet, but one that's certainly farther along. That said, the timing of this is really curious. And decisions aside, this suggests that maybe Mr. Trudeau is in a lot of trouble on the international front. We see trouble in China. We saw an India trip. We saw a prime minister that's suffering on the international affairs front and his foreign policy. So the fact that David McNaughton, might be leaving now suggests that, Mr. Trudeau is in crisis and that, working on the Liberal campaign, which is something that Ambassador McNaughton talked about today, I don't think that does any service to people questioning, what this all means and the timing of it all.
Marcella, what do you make of the timing of all of this?
Well, I will agree with Melissa that I think we all owe Mr. McNaughton a big debt of gratitude. He's one of those rare birds in Canadian politics where there's very few people who ever say a bad word about him. So that tells you, I think, something about the measure of the man. Look, I will disagree with her, however. I don't think this is some big sign of crisis for the Trudeau Liberals. I think that there are different functions that different types of diplomatic leaders especially can play for countries. I think it's pretty clear that Ambassador McNaughton was sent there quite specifically to help us get through the rocky beginning of the relationship with Trump and to help smooth the waters enough to get a decent trade deal done. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's the best person for the job in terms of the next stage of that, by the way, which is to convince a kind of a very divided U.S. Congress with a lot of their own political agendas on the move to pass this agreement. And I'm also a big fan, a big believer in the folks that do diplomatic work for governments for a living. I think there's something to be said for the different approach that a career diplomat might bring to this conversation. And I think sometimes you need someone who can walk more softly, perhaps in the background, to make the case. So I don't think that that's a huge problem for us. It may in fact be an opportunity, sort of under the cover of the Canadian election, for this agreement to get some momentum in the United States.
David, to you, given that there is such division in the United States right now and the Democrats really don't want to give Donald Trump any wins, is there really anything any Canadian ambassador can do to try and nudge the NAFTA process, the NAFTA ratification process along?
I think so. I think there's a lot of work that can be done at the state level. There are a lot of U.S. states, governors, for example, that need this deal to move forward for their individual states. And they, in turn, can put pressure on different congressmen, congresswomen, senators, and that's worked in the past. So a very skilled strategy that goes beyond just working directly with Congress or trying to persuade this White House that we know is unpredictable. It's important to work at all different levels of the U.S. government, which includes the individual states, the governors, the state houses, that can have a lot of influences, especially in those swing states. Think about Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, for example, which are key states in the 2020 election in the U.S., but also are key partners in trade for Canada.
Marcella, I want to ask you, today David McNaughton said as he was leaving at his news conference that he thinks the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is strong. He didn't want to sugarcoat it and say that there have been some bumps along the way. But he said that you can test the strength of a relationship by the ability to have a frank conversation. And that's something that he says can happen quietly behind closed doors. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think, look, I think it is what it is. I'm not sure it matters whether I agree with it. I think he's pretty much describing the real politic right now of dealing with the United States, which is led by a president who is unpredictable, who will not hesitate to use his Twitter platform and his platform in general to change the channel. And if we get into the line of fire of that at an inconvenient moment, that could be a problem. So I think that that's the sort of real politic of the situation, if you will. I do think there's a lot of work on the state level. I will agree with that can be done. And moreover, I think this is an opportunity. We have lots of Provincial governments have trade offices in the States. There may be an opportunity here for some of the provinces to whom this agreement is very important. I'm looking at you, Ontario, and here in Alberta, of course, to play a more direct role in pushing for this agreement to get ratified. And again, I don't think it's that bad a thing that we'll have the sort of noise of the Canadian election to work with under that.
Melissa, last question to you. Ambassador McNaughton today said he will advise if needed for the Liberals in the election campaign. If you were a Liberal, I know that you are not, but if you were a Liberal, would you want to bring McNaughton into the war room given his experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that anybody would agree that that PMO over the last number of months needs some adult supervision, and David McNaughton is the exact guy to provide that. So you don't blame somebody for going in. I want to go back to Marcella's point, though. In terms of engaging provincial premiers, this is where I think we'll feel the loss of Mr. McNaughton, because I think a premier like Doug Ford or a premier like Jason Kenney, who's asked to go and talk to governors of that same stripe, I think they're more likely to answer the call from David McNaughton than they are from Mr. Trudeau in the middle of an election campaign. So there is an actual piece where Mr. McNaughton could have played a role going forward, and I think that loss will be felt.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.